sometimes some of us who are supposedly very conservative, if someone did an analysis, you might find that Shelley Hughes has worked across the aisle and gotten things done, maybe more than some other people, someone else in the building you might assume, because I enjoy it and I think it's a way to get things done. And if we sit in our separate camps and don't talk to one another, we're not going to get anything done.
Hello, East Anchorage. This is Alaska State House Representative Andrew Gray and East Anchorage Matters. The goal of this broadcast is to keep the constituents of Anchorage's Campbell Park, University area, Russian Jack, and Unaka Valley neighborhoods abreast of the relevant happenings in the halls of government of our great state. We begin each episode with an interview with an Alaskan of interest and importance and conclude with a legislative update. Today, our interview is with Senator Shelley Hughes of Palmer. After a childhood in Ohio, she moved to Hoonah, Alaska in the late 70s as a young adult to help establish a religious community with her parents. We talk about that experience, as well as her travels around Alaska with her husband and young family, and ultimately how she ended up involved in Alaska politics. We will also be discussing some of her policy interests. One issue that we discuss is transgender youth. Senator Hughes asked that I add this statement. She unconditionally loves and cares for every transgender youth. She believes we need more civility and kindness in our world, and particularly in our schools. Senator Shelley Hughes, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
You were born in Ohio.
I was. Yes. 1958. I don't mind saying that. People can figure out how old I am. I'm fine with that.
And you grew up there and went to school there,
I went to public school there in Canton, Ohio, home of the Football Hall of Fame, and moved up to Alaska as a teenager, graduating a year early from high school because the family was making the move and I didn't want to start over in a new high school up here. So I did summer school, night school. When we found out, I had about a year to do it, and we boogied up here, lived in Hoonah, actually 3 miles from the town of Hoonah on Game Creek, a settlement there, a Christian community.
The farm?
Yeah, some people call it that. It was Mount Bether Bible Center was the official name, but it was people from all over the United States, primarily highly college-educated folks that wanted to live a lifestyle where they could raise their families away from some of the things that they thought might be healthier for their children not to be around, that kind of thing. And it was actually a great place. I really enjoyed it and to have deep friendships. Yes.
So you, I guess, graduated like after what was ostensibly your junior year. So you
Yes.
graduated when you were 17 and then moved up with the family. And I guess my question is, was it a foregone conclusion that you would definitely come and stay because you were almost 18? Like you were almost old enough to...
Here's the other interesting thing is that I have my older brother went to Princeton, and my younger, he's older than me, but the younger of the two brothers went to Yale. And so I decided I didn't want to go off to college somewhere. I wanted to come with the family to Alaska and then go to college a little later. As it turned out, I fell in love, and I ended up getting married when I was 20 and had my first child when I was 22. So the college and everything happened much later. And
you met your husband in Hoonah?
Yes, Rock is my husband. His name is Roger Hughes, and we call him Rock or Rocky. And yes, I met him there. He had come up from Charleston. He had come back from Vietnam a year or two prior and came up just wanting to try something new. So that's what he did. He had some family member told him about it. He was pretty amazing because when my family, we planned for a year and had a house to sell and all that, where he was a young single guy and he heard about it. And 2 weeks later, he was headed over to Game Creek.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions about that settlement, and you can correct, because you hear people say, oh, they were like the Y2K preppers. Is that a fair assessment?
So this is one of many Christian communities that were across Canada, Alaska, some overseas, South America, Europe. I'm not exactly sure where all in Europe. So they were loosely affiliated as far as the Christian ministry part, but they were all independent at the same time. And I think they started in the 70s, so it was definitely not really, we weren't thinking about decay at that time. But the idea was a wholesome lifestyle, living off the land as much as possible. And some people were really concerned about some of the influences of what they would call the world. But we had so much fun and just deep bond. When you want to bond with friends or family, go camping. We were roughing it because we were building cabins out of the wilderness and had a little sawmill and used wood stoves. We had no running water. We were hauling water from the creek in 5-gallon buckets and using hand wringer washing machines. It was like being in a different century. We were featured in a National Geographic magazine. Alaska Magazine did a write-up. I look back and I'm so glad that I had the time there. Some people, they felt like, I wish wouldn't have done it. But for me, I have good friends. And my mother, actually, who's 94, she lived there up until about a year and a half ago. And she now lives in Juneau with my sister. We've maintained relationships and friendships. They do a community Thanksgiving every year where the town of Hoonah is invited, and a lot of the town's folks come out for a big community meal. And I've actually come back at different times to join them and do that. Yeah.
2 more questions about that. One is that you're very well put together. You're very fashionable. And I'm making a stereotype about being in a small community away from running water and carving wood to build your home. I'm just curious, as an 18-year-old teenage girl, that was the lifestyle you were excited about.
Let me put it this way. I was telling my daughters this. I have 2 girls and 2 boys. I don't even think I wore makeup until I was in my 40s. So I wasn't really into that then. I don't know when that came. I think when I started looking in the mirror and seeing wrinkles and gray hairs or something was more when it started happening. So I enjoyed it. Now, I will say, I mentioned something about being in another century like the Amish. They did have a handful of rules, and one of the rules was that ladies wore dresses. Mm-hmm. And we put on jeans underneath our dresses, and we'd go out into the fields, and we'd be pulling the potatoes and all of that. But fashion wasn't really on my mind at that point.
Last question about this section of your life. The community was established outside of Hoonah, 3 miles outside of Hoonah. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that today the community is very integrated with Hoonah, and that the division is not what it once was. Oh,
you'll get a kick, and your listeners will get a kick. They called us the Pilgrims when we first got there. We were the Pilgrims because we did have some minority groups there, but it was primarily Caucasian, and we're coming up from the lower 48 where a lot of city folks not really knowing what they're doing when trying to settle in a new area. It was friendly, but we were up close to 200 people at one point, and transportation at that time was all by boat. Now there's a logging road. So that's made the connection with town much easier. And then some of the folks that live out at the community also worked in town or had businesses. Tideland Tackle was run by one of the families out at the community, and a couple of them are builders. So very integrated now. But back then it was just difficult getting back and forth. And with the numbers we had, I didn't go into town a lot, and everything you needed was there. They brought things in, and we were growing much of our own food. And yeah, so it was more separate, much more integrated now.
And you met your husband in the community.
Yes.
Would you say the 2 of you have the same religious beliefs as then, or do you feel like your religious beliefs have shifted over time?
I think they have shifted. I think it was somewhat sheltered there. And of course, I was very young, and I think I thought to be faithful and to have strong faith, I needed to be in that setting at that time. I didn't really understand outside of that. It's changed a bit, yes, but in a good way. And I'm thankful for the time there. I don't regret it. There are stories out there about people that had bad experiences in some of these communities. And humans are humans. Sometimes people do things that aren't good, but for me, it was tremendously positive and frankly fun. What later down the road, we lived out in Bethel, and with that time in the 80s, there wasn't a whole lot to do in Bethel, and it's all about relationships and being with people and just having a good time together, sharing meals and going out and playing softball or whatever. And so that time in that community was all about relationships.
So you had your first child when you were 20.
And no, 22.
22.
Married 20. 22, first child, born here in Juneau, almost born at the community. That was an interesting story because I went into labor during the night, and I was going to have a midwife actually, but she canceled, couldn't come. And I had a doctor arranged in Juneau, and he told me, first baby come in a week before your due date. 2 weeks before the due date, I went into labor. Middle of the night in a cabin, way out, actually way from most of the settlement. And we had an RN there, but she had never delivered a baby, and she thought it might have been placenta previa. So they decided they needed to get me in. By then, the contractions were getting pretty strong. Low tide. So I had to be carried on a stretcher by some guys, single guys who had never seen a woman in labor. And they'd stop every time I had a contraction. And it was about a mile hike in pretty squishy mud. And then in a plane, and again, I was ready to have that baby. And they said, no. You're getting moved from a cabin onto a stretcher, then onto their cot in the plane. And then you get to the airport, and there's an ambulance waiting, and you're getting transferred to that. And then you pull up to the hospital, and they're transferring you again. The whole time I wanted to push, and they were like...
Not telling you not to push.
I pushed. They wheeled me in the room.
Was your mom with you?
5 seconds. No, my husband was.
That's your husband.
5 seconds later, after coming in the hospital,
Baby
that baby. Had the baby.
Healthy baby.
Healthy baby, everything fine. But
that's an unusual first child story for sure. Why did you guys leave the settlement?
Now, I mentioned that there was an RN there, but my husband had been a Vietnam medic, and he was interested in going to PA school. That was the program was just being birthed. We'd heard about it, and he was tending to emergency situations. When we had that many people there, you'd have people that needed to be stitched up and such. And at the time, Hoonah didn't have a community health aide on a regular basis. And so he was feeling responsible for a lot of people and didn't feel like he really had the training. So initially, when we talked about leaving, the idea was he would get his training and come back and be of service to the town of Hoonah, be of service to the community. But when he got the training, we ended up not coming back.
Gotcha. So he's a physician assistant like I am. That's an area of commonality that we have. So he got his PA license, and then you guys got your first job in Bethel.
Yes, and then that was part of it too. He wanted to get something that was available. There wasn't actually a PA job in Hoonah, and of course have student loans and such.
Right.
And the first job was with Yukon Customer Health Corporation in Bethel. We enjoyed our time there.
You had more, because you have 4 kids. I don't know how far apart your kids are.
So by that time, number 2 was born, our daughter, and they attended the ME school. The older one started school there, and then I was involved with the parent share preschool there, and I also worked at Phillips Alcoholism Treatment Center as an intake coordinator. And and then from there, he took a position at Fort Yukon Medical Center. And so we were there for a season. He was the medical director. There was another PA that came there. And then from there, Tanana Chiefs offered him a position in Fairbanks. And I had our 3rd child while we were there, born in Fairbanks. We were in Fairbanks briefly when he had an offer down in Seward with the Department of Corrections. And he thought the pay was pretty good, and he liked the schedule. I think it was week on, week off or something. So we moved to Seward, and we're there, and that's where child number 4 was born.
So you had like a child in each place, basically?
Basically, yes.
My staff printed off your resume for me, and you talk about in this particular resume that I have that you were a proud stay-at-home mom, but yet I can see that you're actually doing a lot of stuff during
Yes.
this. You were a newscaster in Bethel?
Volunteer, and it was just fun. You'd sign up and you'd go in, and they had it was television, and I think they might have done it on the radio too. So did that a little bit there. So that was fun. I haven't even looked at that resume for years.
Yeah. And it had that you had taught in the settlement, that you were a teacher at Mount Bethel Christian School for the 5 years that you were there.
Yeah.
So that you, although you were describing yourself as a stay-at-home mom, you had a lot of volunteer opportunities.
Yes. I also was as far as teaching, I also was a instructor in the prison system.
In Seward?
Basis. No, that was actually up in Palmer. So after we left Seward, that's when we moved to Palmer. So at Matsu Pretrial at Palmer Corrections.
Oh, okay.
And did GED preparation classes, resume writing, things like that. So
then you got your college degree in 2002?
Yeah, and I piddled around. It took a long time because I was just doing a lot of different things and raising kids. And so I finally wrapped that up.
And you got your degree in English?
I did. I was thinking about going into teaching, and I decided that wasn't really what I wanted to do, and English was the fastest thing to get.
So it was more about just finishing it off. It wasn't
finishing it, and I had a knack for writing, and I figured I could use that in whatever field I ended up in. So,
did you have a particular area of interest in English literature, a particular period?
I was actually on the rhetoric side, so more the technical writing side. Yeah.
Interesting. You're in Palmer. You've got your degree. I guess you were working as a substitute teacher?
I did a little bit. Yes, I did.
So I'm trying to move to I
started doing community advocacy kind of stuff. One of the very first things, we lived near Colony High and Colony Middle. And as the valley grew, it was very scary coming out on 49th State Street onto the Palmer-Wasilla Highway when high schoolers were getting out of school. And at that point, there were no traffic lights between Palmer and Wasilla. There was one four-way stop about 4 miles out of Palmer, 6 miles from Wasilla. And so I advocated for a traffic light because it was a very dangerous intersection, especially with these young drivers. Collected signatures. Didn't really know what I was doing, but that was the beginning of it. And then as far as you want to pivot into how I got involved in what we're doing now.
Yes.
So one of the things was very important to me was as my children were growing up, if they had friends, I always got to know the parents. That was just something was really important to me. It was great because then you could network with the parents and kind of help make sure that kids are staying out of trouble and such. So when my youngest was in kindergarten, he had a buddy, and we would drive the kids back and forth to play at each other's houses. And the dad ended up deciding he was going to run for state house. And he told the story that he and his wife were in the kitchen, and this was Carl Gallo, Reverend Carl Gallo. She says,
who you became a staffer for.
Yes, briefly. And his wife, and she's a feisty lady, and she said, Carl, if you think I'm going to be your campaign manager, you're wrong. You're going to have to find someone else. And he just kind of looks at her, dumbfounded. Who else can I get? And they both sat there quiet for a minute. And at the same time, they said, Shelley Hughes, because they had watched me do different things. One of the things I did, I would help plant a new church with 50 people that grew to be like 500 people. And one of the things I did with that church was I helped run the summer program for the children. And we went all out. We rented this elementary school and filled it up to the point where the fire marshal said, you cannot have any more children come. You're at capacity. So that they just watched me over the years. When I went for something, I went whole hog. And I remember Carl knocking on my door, pick up his son or something. He asked me, and I just laughed. I said, I don't know anything about that. But I said, but that hasn't stopped me before. Yeah, I'll do it. And I went to Lusac Library and got a big old stack of books and started studying, started making some phone calls because I wasn't in the political scene at all. And he was in a 4-way primary. He was the underdog, the unknown, and he ended up winning that. And then he won a 3-way.
How'd you get him to win that primary?
And what I did is we have a parade every year in June, Colony Days Parade. And it had a theme. And I want to say something like it, building our future or whatever. It had the word building. We went to the trouble to make it be like the best in the parade. I think we won an award. But I also got 50, 75 people to walk in it, which made a big impression because sometimes you'll just have one candidate going down the street waving or whatever. And then I got 5 or 6 guys to wear Carhartt overalls, wear a tool belt, and hold a 2x4. And then one of my friend's daughters was a cheerleader. So she choreographed something really simple. These men were not dancers, but choreographed something where, so in front of the judges, they could do the thing and up and down the line. And it stole the show. And it got attention. Nobody knew who it was. Then everybody knew. We got photo in the paper. Another thing, which newspapers are obsolete, but I saw that they were starting something new at our little Frontiersman newspaper. And that's where you could get sticky notes and you could schedule to get them on the front.
This is late 90s, early 2000s, or?
Yeah, early 2000s. Okay. And I scheduled for days leading up to the primary and to the general to do those sticky notes. And everywhere you went, the newspaper box, and we came up with Gotta Vote Gatto. At the parade, we had paper fans, cardboard fans, and it says, I'm a fan of Gatto. So people walking around. So just doing things that were creative and different. His name rose to the top, and he got the name recognition. He won. So I was an aide very briefly in district. It was just little segments here and there.
So you didn't go to Juneau?
No. He asked me to come to Juneau and be his chief of staff. I thought, oh, that's what you do with your kid. And it's like, first of all, Carl, you need somebody's experience, and I am not. And secondly, I'm not going to leave my kids, so find somebody else.
I would guess your kids were probably in high school.
My last 2 graduated in 06 and 08.
Oh, okay.
This was 2002.
Okay.
So they were still middle school at that point.
Gotcha. But I'm guessing that you'd been bit by the bug, so to speak, in terms of being involved in politics.
And I was tracking what he was doing. I had met people. Yes.
Was your family supportive of you getting involved in political life? I know that running a campaign and doing what you did took a lot of time.
Yes, they were initially. In fact, when I decided I was going to step up and do it, I didn't want to go whole hog and announce it or anything until my husband was good with it.
When you ran for the House the first time?
When I ran for the House first time. And it took him about a year because I was looking pretty far out. And it was funny because as the end of that year approached and it's like, you got to file and you're actually going to do this thing, I started getting cold feet. I still didn't know where he stood. He and my daughter love to go to thrift stores. I sometimes get annoyed when they come back because, all this junk.
We don't need more stuff.
I don't want more stuff. They came back and I still didn't know. My husband had not said anything positive. He was still like, I don't know about this kind of thing. He came back from the thrift store and handed me a box and he said, open it. It was a mug. I said, we do not need another coffee mug. He says, open it. I pulled it out of the box and he said, if you want a clean house, elect a woman to office. Now, that's a little bit kind of old school, but he was like, I think you should do this. I think you're cut out for it. You have the right temperament, the gifts and the strengths you need to do it. I think this is what you should be doing. I think it's going to be good.
It's a question that came up for me because, again, it's a stereotype, but when I think of a religious community where women wear dresses and don't wear makeup, that's a community where, in general, the men are the leaders and the women are not.
It was pretty mixed there. Actually, it was governed by a board of elders, and half of them were women. So it was more really
feminist.
It was pretty balanced, but yeah.
So he was supportive, and you ran for the House in what year?
That was my first year serving was 2013. So 2012 was the campaign. Representative Carl Gatto passed away in May, and then I ended up getting the appointment at that time.
The first time running, did you have a smooth sailing?
I had run Representative Gatto's campaign, and I helped him a few years after it until he was really solid. I think I knew what I was getting into. The fundraising was challenging. I didn't want to tell you when I got appointed, though. So the district forwards 3 names.
Parnell?
It was Parnell. But they take their little votes in the district, and I came in third.
Oh.
Guess who came in first?
Who?
David Eastman. He lived in the district then. And there was another gentleman who served on the MEA board, a nice guy. But yeah.
But you were the one selected, and then you had the power of the incumbency by having been appointed.
Right.
And
I've never had a free ride, though. It's always been good because
you've always had a challenger.
Somebody steps up, which is really good because I think the voters learn more about the issues when that happens.
What year did you make the move to the Senate?
2016 was the election year, so 17 was the first year.
And was that an easy decision?
It was. See, Senator Stoltz had announced I did not have a heads up. I had no clue. I think other people maybe did, so I had to make a very fast decision because we had the other House member was Kathy Tilton, Speaker Tilton, and she hadn't been in quite as long as I did, and she maybe was thinking about running. I think Representative Johnson maybe had run against Senator Stoltz the previous election, I think maybe. But so I'm sure she was probably thinking. So there were a lot of people thinking
But you got your name out there first?
Adam Crum actually ran as well. And that was tough because that was back when we got stuck down here. We were here in June.
So you weren't able to
I think we figured like raising money and knocking on doors had 3 weeks.
Wow. And
polling showed that I was way ahead at the beginning, but Adam Crum I think because he was there working and I only beat him by 7%. So it was closing in. Had the election been just a couple more weeks, he might have beat me. Yeah, but I knew it was the right time. And I actually think the way I work and just my personality, I think I'm a better fit for the Senate. I'm not scrappy. I'm just not. Some people are, it's a good fit for them.
I want to ask about being in the minority in the Senate with a 17-member majority and how you came to be in the super minority and what that experience is.
I think it really boils down to the position on the PFD and what was happening with that. It was not easy, Andrew, being Senate Majority Leader and then all of a sudden being kicked to the curb. And I had quite what I felt was a really moderate, reasonable plan to work with the others, and they had already made their decision, and that was that.
Because you've been in the fiscal policy working group
twice, yeah. And I felt like it offered what was a great way to build consensus between the two camps. It was tough, but I think it was really the PFD that caused it. And when you're in a majority in the Senate, of course, there had been a very much a binding rule as far as the budget at one time. And then in our majority, we were basically prior, it was when Senator Giesel was president, we had made the agreement as part of the organization that the PFD would be a separate vote so that we wouldn't have that problem. And then that got changed at the last minute and put some of us in a bind. And I teased the other night after the joint floor session, in the attempt to override the governor's veto, there were some Senate majority members that didn't vote with the rest of the majority. And I said, that's the very thing that caused me to get kicked to the curb and stripped of committees, because there was no exception made. And yet we had gone into organization saying we're going to keep the PFD separate. And then at the end, it was not. And that's when things started going downhill. It's actually been interesting being in the Senate minority. It's a different vantage point.
I've only been in the minority, so I have nothing to compare it to. What I'll say is that I was grateful for being in the minority last year because needed this space to learn how this building worked. I can't imagine the pressure that, because there were so many freshmen in my class, that some of them had to have a gavel and run a committee. And I'm grateful to watch because I didn't know how to do that.
Yeah, I can see where that would be.
But you're in the opposite position, having the former Senate Majority Leader and then being in a very small minority.
Right.
So I would imagine that you really don't need time to watch and learn.
But it's also given me an opportunity to really focus on policy issues. And I have a very good relationship with the Senate President. and with the finance co-chairs, for instance, and they've been really respectful. And I think our Senate president, he is someone who really tried to honor and respect the process. And I am the ranking member, I guess you'd say, of the Senate minorities. They're good about keeping me informed, even though we're a tiny minority. Yeah, given me the ability for instance, the artificial intelligence, the AI stuff that I'm working on. We had a fascinating hearing today, in fact, with an A team as far as experts and national experts. We brought in people that really know their stuff. It blew me away. It's, whoa, I told my staffer, you did an awesome job.
I need to watch that hearing. I'm very interested in the AI stuff. One of the policy positions that you're known for is trans girls in sports. You had the bill in the previous session, and the ACLU sued the Mat-Su school district yesterday. They sued the Mat-Su school district on behalf of a trans boy in Mat-Su school to be able to use the restroom. I'm curious if you want to, if we can talk a little bit about that policy position and why it's important to you.
So it's important to me because when I went to high school, so you go back when Title IX was passed, it was not yet implemented when I was in high school. And I think my era, in some schools they were starting, but maybe just my town was behind the game. But I grew up with older brothers, so I was out playing basketball and doing all those kind of things. And I'd be the first one picked on a team in gym class, that kind of thing. But there were no opportunities for me. But with my daughters, there were. My daughter played varsity basketball. So I knew how important it was. And what I was trying to do was craft something that every student, every child would get two opportunities. They could either play on a team associated with their sex at birth or in a co-ed team. And I felt like it was a pretty reasonable way to go about it. I do continue to be concerned about girls, especially at the college level, but it starts young too, that you could have coaches are really competitive. And so a girl could miss an opportunity, a spot on a team, I think, if you don't have this kind of policy. So it was really just to keep that erosion from happening and take away those opportunities for the girls that my generation worked hard to get, and just wanted to maintain that. And yeah. And by the way, they were not willing to testify, but I had some wonderful conversations with transgender individuals who were very supportive of the bill. But they said they could not speak out. They could not give their name because they were concerned. They didn't want to be bullied, and they just wanted to stay out of the limelight. That people don't understand. There was quite a spectrum of folks that were supporting it. And I had a number of Democrats come in my office and tell me they supported it. I understand there's some leadership in the Democrat Party who supported it, but they weren't going to speak out on it. I think it is one of those things where we don't want to harm any child. Every child needs an opportunity. And as delicately as we could handle it, we'll see what the courts do with that particular case.
A couple of follow-ups. One is I appreciate being thankful for Title IX. One thing that I've observed is that even with Title IX, boys' sports tend to get more attention and more funding. And do you want girls' sports to get more attention and more funding? Like, is that?
I think it should be based on the number of girls going out and things. It should be as equitable as possible. I haven't studied the numbers as far as in high schools, what numbers go out for this or that, but I didn't notice a disparity when my kids were in high school at Colony, because I had a son who went through the varsity basketball program and a daughter that went through the varsity basketball. It seemed like it was pretty fair, but if there were a place where it isn't, it should be.
And the other thing is we really have seen so many bills filed in the last few years. And when we go back 2015, 2016, 2017, it's a fraction of the numbers today. 503 trans bills filed in state legislatures in 2023, 420 filed in 2024 so far.
So this is on an issue, not just on the sports.
Not just on the sports. Some of them are bathroom, locker room sports. Some are access to healthcare, and some are others that just single out transgender. This is not just for schools. But why do you think that we have so much more attention being paid to this issue in the last few years?
I think if you can look at the numbers, and I'm not really up on this right now. If I'd known you, I might have studied up a little bit. But the numbers of students that are identifying as trans is way, way astronomically up. And so you have to ask the question, why is that happening too? I think that's where the increased interest, and I know they're rare, but there have been cases where, a parent of a daughter just wants to make sure a guy's not coming into the bathroom. And I'm not sure what the solution is.
I had your sponsor statement for SB 140, and I read it, and the concern that it would be unfair for girls to be competing with a trans girl, that the trans girl would have some physical benefits that might make it unfair. But I also saw, my notes are a mess, that the International Chess Federation had banned trans women from competing in female chess. And there was an international disc golf tournament that banned trans women from competing in disc golf. And there are some of these where I'm a little bit questioning.
On the physical thing?
Yeah.
Did you
like
say
chess?
As like a chessboard?
Like chessboard, yeah. Because that's not a physical.
No, that's odd.
Okay, so you admit that's odd. That some of these, there's also one for pool, like 8-ball billiards. Yeah. That there was also a ban from certain pool competitions from trans women competing. So you would say that is odd.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that. There's going to be co-ed. It just reminds me, my daughter, she did YWAM. Are you familiar with YWAM, Youth with a Mission? So she was over in Africa. Then she came back and went to WAMI. And she did a summer internship kind of thing. It was required where and I can't remember what village it was, but it was off the road system. And it was not a dry village because there was a bar with a pool table. And on a Friday night, she went in there and watched a couple guys play pool and said, hey, I'd like to play. And they just laughed. Mm-hmm. She ended up beating everybody in there because she was actually teaching billiards at University of. It's funny. So actually, yeah.
Last question on this issue. The governor had an HB 105. It's morphed a little bit. And this was a permission slip that parents had to sign as to what nickname or pronouns their child could be called at school. And I was curious if you had any opinion about that bill or if you supported that bill.
I do support that. I know there can be cases where you have to watch out for abuse and things. So you have to be sensitive, and there should be an exception for that. There was a lot of debate about parental notification versus consent for a minor getting an abortion. And there was an exception because a girl could be in a situation where it just wouldn't be safe to try to get that consent. Yeah,
What my question is, and because I feel like the legislation doesn't really spell it out very clearly, what is it a teacher or a school's responsibility if they have a permission slip and the child refuses to use the name or the pronouns on the permission slip? What should the school do, or the teacher? How do they enforce the permission slip if the child refuses to use the name or the pronouns?
That would be a challenge. That teacher could probably just say, I'm going to just call everyone by their last name.
Right. And I guess the other part of that for me, just again, thinking about it from a parental rights perspective, I'm curious if the parent says, I want my child to use this name and these pronouns, and the child refuses. What are the parenting techniques? What does a parent do if their child insists on using a different name or different pronouns than what the parent believes they should be using? And I think that, and I bring it up because I think if we're going to possibly implement a policy like this, I think that there should be some thought about resources does a parent have if the child is not using the name and the pronouns on the permission slip.
If I had school-age children, I probably would have a ready answer for you, but I haven't even actually thought that one through because my sense that bill is not going to move here in the Senate, so I haven't devoted a whole lot of time and thought to it. Counseling is always important. The parents with the child, I think, would be important. I'm a person of faith, so I'd be praying about it and just really seeking wisdom because you love your child, right? And you want what's best for them. And yeah, I think it's so important in these kinds of situations. And the mental health of our young people it's really challenging right now. Some of the data that's out there as far as depression and suicide, it's so important for the children to know that they're loved and accepted. And I think in our busy world, I think parents need to stop and make sure that connection's happening. I remember when my children were approaching teen years, people used to joke, oh, that's going to be terrible. I loved it when my kids were teens. I just loved it. I can see my son, he's now a pilot. He's about to graduate from law school. He's Air Force. And he's like 250 pounds, this big 6'4" guy. But in high school, he'd hop up on the kitchen counter, like while fixing dinner or whatever, and just talk about what was happening in school. I was like, oh my gosh, I am so blessed. And so parents need to just slow down and have time for their children. It's the connection. And it's not just quality, it's quantity too. You got to have some quantity time with them.
I'm 48 years old. When I was in first or second grade, I remember the teacher having us line up boys on one line, girls on the other. And my best friends when I was around that age were all girls. Mm-hmm. And I remember being very uncomfortable. It's one of my first memories of me having to go get in the line with the boys because I didn't roughhouse with the boys at recess when I was in first grade. I played with the girls. And that was in the early 80s. And, you know, I was not really conforming to the gender stereotypes. I mean, definitely, I grew up in a religious household. My dad didn't want to have a sissy as a son. That was the word he would use. So there was a lot of making sure that I didn't play with dolls and that sort of stuff. And in the culture at that time, that was like, you must be gay. Mm-hmm. If I had been a child now, there's like more options on the table. When I look at kids today, I just think that there's more freedom, like that they don't have to do certain things or behave in a certain way. And I see it as them having more freedom than I had. And about the prayer thing, I'll just say I did pray a lot. Mm-hmm. I prayed for God to make me different. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And for me, that freed me from that religion. I let go. And yet I still have my Southern Baptist grandfather inside me saying, this is what this book says. And it is true. Mm-hmm. And we believe it. And I let it go. I guess that's a long way of saying, I know where you're coming from and I understand it. And it just didn't work for me. Mm-hmm. I couldn't make me into who I felt my family thought I should be, who my religion thought I should be. And so that's my perspective when I'm looking at all of these laws coming forward that are shining a light on this small group of kids. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the things I've always wondered too is we're all created uniquely, right? And even I have a lot of kind of male qualities. Mm-hmm. And it works. And everybody's going to have a different mix. And there's a certain, and maybe most women are more feminine, most men are more masculine. But it's not, there's so many people it is a real mix. And yeah. I often wear the pants in my family. I do.
Shelley Hughes, thank you so much.
We didn't even get to talk about food security.
Do you want to talk about food security? We have that. We shared this. I interviewed Mike Jones for this podcast. He's an ICER researcher, focusing really on how food gets transported, particularly out to the most rural villages, and ways to improve the efficiency of transporting perishable food so that it arrives fresh enough to be sold in the store and eaten, which unfortunately, even in 2024, is not happening on a regular. There's big problems.
Yeah, I feel really blessed that Mike Jones, PhD Mike Jones, is part of our task force, because when we actually were putting together the legislation for having the task force, I was actually the one that added somebody from ICER, because I felt like you've got to have a baseline. You've got to know what's going on. He has just jumped in with 2 feet, and he's been great. So yeah, the food security. And I think it's good for your listeners to know someone from Red Matsu. I love working across the aisle. I've gotten a lot done, and it just probably some of my favorite experiences working with Tom Begich on the READS Act, the food security stuff. I worked on sexual assault legislation with Guarantor. So some of what I think are the crowning achievements of things that have happened in this building I've been able to be on the tip of the spear with some really good people. And the food security is a big one. It's going to go on for some time. I think that there's a lot of public support, bipartisan, bicameral. And the main thing is that we not just talk about recommendations, but we actually do concrete policy changes. I think there's potential to do that. I'm hoping the Food Strategy Task Force is actually being given time in each of the resources committee here in the middle of February. So that's a huge.
I want to comment on talking about working across the aisle, and because when we started off this interview, before we started, you said you're probably going to take some flack for having you on. And I know I will, but I think it's really important to put my money where my mouth is. I believe all of us are people. We believe what we believe because our life experiences have led us to this moment. And the vast majority of us are doing what we think is right.
Absolutely.
And I think being willing to have conversations with people and trying to understand where they're coming from, why they believe what they believe, and seeing it from their perspective. And the scary thing, and you know this, the scary thing is that it's easier to just be around people who believe the same as you, to watch the news that caters to the way you see the world, to live in a bubble. It's comfortable.
And one of the things I have found, and I've been telling people, it was one of the eye-opening things when you first came in as a freshman. There were 2 things. I knew that it was really important to figure out who I could trust. That was really important, that as far as getting accurate information. But the second thing was I realized that when I heard from or had a conversation with someone who was on the opposite of an issue, that I actually learned a lot more from them than learned from somebody I agreed with, right? And then what I also, with that, I was constantly looking for points of consensus. And there's so many points of consensus where you can move things forward, where you aren't forsaking your values. I'm not forsaking my values, but we can actually do a tremendous amount. And that the READS Act was a perfect example. And I had so many delightful meetings with Tom Begich trying to figure it out. And even when we thought we were apart, we figured out a way to make it work. And we need more of that. We need more of that. And
you came and testified to Ways and Means last year, and you quoted from a study about higher birth weights in Alaska during years of higher PFDs. And this is an average, but it's statistically significant. A certain number of grams more per baby on average in high PFD years as opposed to low PFD years. And I made a joke about it, but the truth is that I did find the study. The study is real. We really do have bigger birth weight babies in higher PFD years. And that really matters to me. And I have quoted it. I have quoted that study. I give you credit for bringing that study to my attention. I quoted it in Judiciary the week before last. I'll continue to. And for me, it's why I stand by a larger PFD every time. I do not believe in balancing the budget on cutting the PFD because it absolutely disproportionately affects the poorest of Alaskans. Mm-hmm. And that's a place where you and I have a lot of overlap.
I know. People were shocked that I proposed a bill to expand the senior benefit program, and it's actually a longer extension than probably the vehicle that's moving through, although that may be amended. Again, these are people who lived a long life. They're not in a position where they are physically able to go out and get another job. I've seen dreadful commercials like you probably have in other nations where they're begging for money for these people that are in horrible conditions and starving. This is Alaska. This is America. We do not treat our seniors that way. And I don't want a senior in your community or my community having to decide between getting groceries or having the heat and lights on. It's the least we can do. Yeah, so sometimes some of us who are supposedly very conservative, if someone did an analysis, you might find that Shelley Hughes has worked across the aisle and gotten things done maybe more than someone else in the building you might assume, because I enjoy it. And I think it's a way to get things done. And if we sit in our separate camps and don't talk to one another, we're not going to get anything done.
Because I know you focused on rhetoric when you were an English major, but do you have any favorite books or any books that you recommend to folks?
Boy, I do recommend the Bible. There is this one I've been recommending lately. And I bought a bunch of copies for people and have given them out. I think that's my...
So this is The Price We Pay, What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It by Marty Makary.
I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. You'll see, he'll be on CNN and the different news stations.
I'm going to read this book because your husband and I have the same profession, and Alaska has the highest healthcare costs in the country. And I don't think we're having honest conversations.
Yeah, we are. And he looks at it from many different angles. There's not one magic bowl. It's a lot of things that can be done. And I would love at some point, I'm very excited. Food security is a priority this year. But at some point, healthcare cost needs, it has not been in this building.
We need to do it. We need to do it. And I don't know why it's so difficult for us to have that conversation.
Yeah. And I've had a bill that's been out there for a while. It's modeled after something, I think, out of Vermont or somewhere that has to do with incentives for people to incentivize for them to shop. Because the transparency thing didn't really work.
It didn't.
All the states have that.
The transparency thing, the problem is that you show up someplace and you're sick and you're going to get seen. You know what I mean? You're not going to drive around town and find someplace else.
All these codes, you don't even know.
You don't know what they even mean.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you don't know what to ask for, so it doesn't work.
Well, Shelley Hughes, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Now, for the legislative update for today, Monday, February 5th, 2024. On Friday, the House passed House Bill 129, sponsored by Sarah Vance of Homer. There was some confusion as to why I supported this bill, so I would like to explain. Because of Alaska's automatic voter registration with the PFD, pretty much every eligible voter in this state is registered to vote. We also have a highly transient population, and when folks move away, they remain on our voter rolls for 8 years before being removed. This results in Alaska having more than 100% registered voters. That's problematic and provides fuel to folks who question the security of our election system. What HB 129 does is streamline the process for removing folks from the rolls. It makes some common sense changes, like notifying people via forwardable mail as opposed to non-forwardable mail as we used to do it. It also sends them an email. There is some concern that rural folks may not get their mail notifications quickly enough and then could be inadvertently removed from the voter rolls by mistake. Well, if those folks register for a PFD, they will be registered to vote again. Furthermore, if someone hasn't voted recently and fails to return a card stating that they want to remain an Alaskan voter, they will first become inactive. The way to reactivate yourself is simply to vote. So really, this bill is not disenfranchising people. It's a step in the right direction to having more accurate voter rolls. In the past 2 legislative updates, I have discussed education funding, and in particular House Bill 140, which has turned into an omnibus education bill, which contains improvements to internet in rural schools, a modest increase to the base student allocation, and some changes to the way charter schools are approved in Alaska. A recent Harvard study ranked charter schools from around the country, and Alaska ranked number 1. The author of that study will be in the Capitol next week, and I hope to interview him for next week's podcast. Based on that Harvard study, some folks in the legislature want, instead of a massive increase in public education funding, a move towards modeling all of our public education system on charter schools. I gave a little speech on the floor last week about the trouble with that scenario.
My son also attends a K-8 charter school. I'm very proud of the charter school system in our state and in Anchorage, but I just want to point out 2 quick things. Number 1, my husband drives my son to school every morning and picks him up after school every day because we are privileged to have a parent in the household with that kind of flexibility in their schedule. And not every parent in the Anchorage School District can drive their kid to school every morning and pick them up. The second part, and this is just one example, my son goes to a German charter school. New teachers in Germany are able to do their student teaching at my son's school. The parents are asked to provide a homestay with us, these teachers. And then there's this extra student teacher in the room with the kids. The parents are basically housing them for free. And so there's this absolutely additional dollar amount that's not really being accounted for, where we have these extra teachers in the building that are not part of ASD. It's a great model. You've got a lot more adults teaching kids in schools. I'm not sure how we homestay other teachers in public school. I'm just saying we want to extend the model to all schools, make them all like our charter schools. I don't know how we can actually do that, but I'm eager to hear how we can provide all this, do that model more largely. I would say one thing for sure, though. My son benefits from a small class size with all these teachers around. All kids would benefit from small class sizes. And the way we have to do that is hire more teachers, which means we need money to pay them. We need more money. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. For those of you who are listening to this on the East Anchorage Book Club podcast, please know that during legislative session, I publish a different podcast, this one, East Anchorage Matters. Make sure you are subscribed to East Anchorage Matters. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call my office, 907-465-4940.